All right, I want to make a quick review video of these Yamaha NS-6490 three-way bookshelf speakers you see here on the left. You see them up against next to these JBL Studio 530s, which I use to A/B compare them to with the Yamaha AS301 integrated amplifier you see here on the left. So these are three-way bookshelf speakers that are kind of flawed, but they have their redeeming qualities as well. The biggest reason I think that contributes to their flaws as well as their redeeming qualities is the lack of a crossover network. There's only, I think, a capacitor or a resistor between the amplifier and the treble side. I can't remember if it was both tweeters or one tweeter, but there's only one resistor capacitor for the tweeter, and that's it. That's all there is in terms of crossover network. The woofer is pretty much directly driven, and so between the amplifier and the drivers, there's pretty much nothing. There's the enclosure and just that one capacitor for the higher end, and that's it. Other than that, these two, I believe, might even be directly driven. This one is directly driven for, this driver is directly driven for sure. Now, a little bit more about this speaker. Its name has changed and how the model number has changed over the years. But these speakers, I believe Yamaha has pretty much been making for 1 or 2 decades without much change. I mean, they might have done some to the cosmetics, but as far as the lack of crossover network or the crossover network and the drivers and the enclosure, I think they're pretty much the same, and they've been sold under different model numbers with some variations to the cosmetics. But as far as the drivers and the enclosure and the crossover network or the lack thereof of a crossover network, I believe these haven't changed for a few decades. And they're now being sold as the NS-6490s. But I think that also shows because this really excels with 80s and 90s music. Zeos has a video on this, and before I watched that video review of these speakers, I actually came to the same conclusion that, wow, you know, 80s and 90s music seem to sound like really good on these, or they seem to sound how I remember them to how I remember those songs to sound back from when I used to listen to them in my childhood. So he actually mentioned that as well. And so I find it, he mentioned it in terms of 90s hip hop, but I found that true for a lot of 80s and 90s music coming through these speakers. Now let's start with the treble. The treble on these speakers is very bright and fatiguing. With that said, the treble is also extremely transparent, and you can hear just about every detail in the sound that comes through them. Again, it'll be bright and fatiguing, but you can hear every last detail of what's inside the track, probably because of the lack of crossover. Also, where these, another flaw of the way these speakers are, I think, designed is that the treble doesn't integrate very well with the rest of the sound or the rest of the sound that comes out of the speaker. There's some overlap between the mid-range, and it sounds, there's a lot of lack of cohesion in terms of how the treble integrates with the rest of the sound, although it's very transparent. Now, regarding the bright and fatiguing nature of the treble, I was able to fix that with equalization. So I was able to turn down the treble on my integrated amplifier, which made the sound less fatiguing and less bright. And it didn't impact the transparency of the treble. I found that pretty cool. So you can get rid of the brightness, get rid of the fatiguing nature of the treble, but it still retains all of its transparency. With that said, it did not improve the cohesion. It didn't improve how the treble is integrates with the rest of the drivers or the rest of the sound. It was still pretty not cohesive, but at least it wasn't bright. So that's good, because I feel like if it's bright or fatiguing, you're just not going to want to listen to the speaker. Whereas lack of cohesion, and you could sometimes tolerate that, but if it's just ear piercing, it's just not going to be pleasant. You're not going to listen to it. Lack of cohesion, you could, you know, still enjoy listening to it. And that lack of cohesion becomes very apparent in A-B comparison. In isolation, you know, if you're listening, really listening critically, you can tell, but it's not as apparent. Another thing about the treble, it's very, very forward. It's very transparent. And so like you guys said, you can hear everything and is bright, but it's also very forward. And especially in comparison to these JBL 530s. I used to think the JBL 530s treble was pretty clear and also pretty forward. Not until I heard these Yamahas. These are even more forward, more transparent, but a lot more fatiguing and bright compared to these JBL 530s. JBL 530s are not bright or fatiguing at all, but they are, I always felt like the sound was a little bit forward and pretty transparent, but these are even more forward and even more transparent with the trade-off of being bright. All right, moving on to the mid-range. I feel like that's where these speakers really excel, is in the mid-range. Again, there's lack of cohesion with how it integrates with the treble and the bass, but the bass is pretty much non-existent. I'll get into that later. But the mid-range, lower and upper mid-range is really where I feel like these speakers excel, especially with vocals. You can hear everything in the artist's voice. You can hear all of their inflections. You can also hear if they take a breath. And I think that largely has to do with this 7 or 8 inch woofer being directly driven by the amplifier. There's no crossover network between the amplifier and this woofer. And I feel like this driver is pretty good. And most of the mid-range, if not all of it, is coming out of this woofer. I think there may be some out of this too, but I think this is doing a lot of the vocals. And so I don't think this driver is all that bad because it's so clear, so transparent, and it's also, the sound is very forward. And I attribute that to this speaker having little to no crossover network and this woofer being directly driven by the amplifier. That makes for very interesting speaker design, and the benefit is it being very clear, very transparent, but the downside is it not integrating well with the rest of the sound, and the sound being very forward. I'm going to get into a little bit later about how that cohesion and integration takes away from the immersiveness of the music, but for now I'll leave it at that. What else did I say about the mid-range is it's very transparent. That's about it. And so I feel like the mid-range was pretty good and very clear. Now moving on to the bass. I feel like the bass, especially in comparison to these JBL 530s with the 5 1/4 inch driver, is non-existent. These JBLs have so much more bass than these Yamahas. In spite of this having a 7 or 8 inch woofer, the bass is absolutely lacking, and is lacking to the point where I feel like you're actually missing some parts of the music that are important for immersiveness or actually enjoyment of the music. Whereas these JBLs, in spite of them only having a 5 1/4 inch driver, the nature of this driver, the nature of the enclosure, these speakers being ported lends it to have a lot more bass, which ends up to having a more enjoyable listening experience than these Yamahas. These Yamahas have a sealed enclosure, directly driven woofer, and this woofer just does not output much bass. And it also has, possibly because the woofer doesn't have much throw, whereas this one, I feel like, in spite of it being so small, has quite a bit of throw. I just find that very interesting that a 5 1/4 inch driver can have so much more bass than a 7 or 8 inch woofer driver on these Yamahas. And that goes to show that, the displacement is not always, the driver size is not always everything. It has a lot to do with how the driver is designed and how it is complemented with the enclosure. And as you can see with these JBLs, they have a lot of waveguides. They've done a lot of work to make sure the sound is projected well, in terms of there's a waveguide. This 5 1/4 inch woofer is sitting inside a waveguide along with this tweeter, where there's just about there's pretty much no waveguides for any of these drivers. They're just drivers inside a poorly braced rectangular box with no port. Whereas these JBL 530s, they're all this sides enclosures are angled. They have a lot of thought put behind these waveguides. There's ported. There's a pretty extensive crossover network. So there's a lot more engineering that's gone into this speaker than it seems like there's gone into here. So with that said, I think that also impacts the amount of bass that these speakers reproduce. I did couple these with a very budget Sony SW-A2500 subwoofer, and it absolutely added to the experience, the listening experience. It filled in a lot of the, even in spite of that Sony being a super budget 8 or 10-inch subwoofer, it filled in a lot of the missing lows that these bookshelves lacked. So if you're going to use these, I would absolutely recommend using them and suggest using these bookshelf speakers with a subwoofer, just because of the lack of low end and the fact that I even believe it takes away from the immersiveness and parts of the music that were intended to be critical to listening to the track. So these, I think, absolutely have to be coupled with a subwoofer. I mean, if you don't, it's fine, but there's so much, in my opinion, there's so much lacking bass that it actually takes away from the listening experience. So I don't have that feeling about the JBL 530s. I feel like even without a subwoofer, you're not missing a full immersive experience of listening to the music. I mean, there's still low notes you're gonna miss without a subwoofer with these, but for the main part of the music, these do a good job of reproducing bass, whereas these Yamahas do not. Now, the overall take on these speakers is that they are super transparent to the point that they can be fatiguing. The fatiguing part of that can be equalized out. And again, another thing I want to mention is these drivers are not inverted for the other speakers. So the other speaker is identical, with the highest end tweeter on the right and this mid-range tweeter being on the left. It's the same. They didn't flip it for the other speaker. So that kind of takes away from the cohesiveness or the sound staging of the speaker as well. So the drivers are, as I mentioned, they don't have a crossover. It takes away from the synergy and the cohesion of the speaker. I feel like because these drivers, there's the lack of crossover network. One driver is doing some of the work of the other driver, and the overall sound is a little bit messy, and there's a lack of cohesion. The best analogy I can make for these Yamaha speakers is that they're like well-intentioned, good kids with poor parenting. So these drivers are pretty good drivers, but they're uncontrolled. They have a poor enclosure, they have little to no crossover network, and they're close to being directly driven from the amplifier. So that makes them super transparent and super revealing, all the while having poor etiquette, the drivers trying to talk over each other, leading to a lack of cohesion, and being very forward and bright. And so I think you could make that analogy for children, like poorly behaved children from lack of parenting. The children are innocent, they're nice, they're actually well-intentioned, just like these drivers, but then without proper parenting, they may say things that are inappropriate, just of being very transparent and honest, just like these drivers. And then they're gonna have lack of cohesion, lack of good behavior. They're gonna talk over each other in conversation because there's no crossover network, or they haven't been told how to take turns. And so I feel like the way to sum this speaker up are good children, nice children, well-intentioned, with very poor control and parenting. Moving on, I wanted to say that these speakers do excel in 80s and 90s music, as I mentioned earlier. I listened to Aerosmith's Eat the Rich, and I almost feel like that song was mastered on these speakers. It sounded perfect and very good on the speakers. And every now and then I'll come across a track that I feel like was meant to be played on these speakers or these type of speakers. And a lot, I find those mostly with like 80s to 90s music. And another area these speakers excel are in songs with just one instrument. If there's just one instrument, there's not too much going on. Because of that transparency, and it sounds very clear. And also tracks that are heavy on vocals, these speakers kind of excel. And I attribute that to it not be the cohesiveness not being as important when only one instrument is coming through. When one instrument is coming through, if it overlaps a little, it's probably not going to make a big problem in terms of listening to sound. But what you're going to prioritize at that point is the transparency. So you can hear how the piano sounds exactly, or how the guitar sounds with the artist moving his or her fingers on the strings, and how that, sound from the strings vibrations come through. It's super transparent on these Yamahas. But then you start layering drum tracks on it, cowbell, cymbals. These speakers really, the cohesion really starts to fall apart. The sound imposes on each other, the drivers impose on each other. And because of that lack of cohesion, you lose a lot of depth to the song and a lot of soundstage. I think the driver, these drivers being the exact same on both sides and not being inverted, also leads to the lack of cohesion and soundstage as well. Now, with that said, I think these speakers could be used to analyze sounds in tracks. And I think that lends me to that. I've never heard the Yamaha NS10s, but I've read that they were really, liked, used in studios all the time, and mixing artists or people who mastered music really swore by the Yamaha NS10s. And these Yamahas help me understand that. And the way they help me understand that is that the sounds are extremely transparent. So if you want to listen to a particular sound in a track and see, was it recorded properly? Was there some background noise, or is there something in that sound that was it not recorded properly? Is there too much pop in the artist's voice, or was that cowbell, have a crack in it or something? If you're trying to really analyze the sound, these speakers are great for that because they're super transparent. And if you're trying to see how that sound in the track relates or balances with the rest of the track, this is not going to do it. I mean, because it's a flawed speaker. It's not going to integrate very well. It's not going to, the sound's not balanced. But if you're just trying to analyze that one sound, because these are so transparent, you will be able to pick it out and really listen to the texture, the nature of the sound you're trying to analyze, even if it's within the track. But how that sound relates to its loudness in relation to the rest of the music, I don't think it's very good for. So that's where I can understand why the NS10s or even maybe this speaker could be used in conjunction with studio monitors to mix or master music, because I could never see these being used in complete isolation or by themselves for that sole purpose, but using them as a tool just to analyze one particular sound, I could absolutely see these being used. And I believe maybe that's possibly what the Yamaha NS10s were used for. And I think that's largely because of the lack of a crossover network. It's pretty much just about being directly driven by the amplifier, and it lends to a maximum transparency and a lot of clarity to the track. All right, the last thing I want to say about these speakers is I could absolutely see someone actually being happy with these speakers If someone had purchased them, I could see them being happy with them because of the transparency to the sound. Now, in A-B comparison, compared to other speakers such as this JBL 530 here on the right, it's night and day difference in terms of the quality of the sound, the sound stage, the depth, the control of how the music is presented. It's night and day that this JBL is leagues ahead of this Yamaha. But in isolation, if you were to have these speakers coupled with the subwoofer, I can absolutely see someone not only being happy with them, but even being impressed. I mean, without A-B comparison, if I really listen, I can pick out why they're flawed. It becomes very apparent why they're flawed in A-B comparison, but in isolation, I can still notice where they're flawed. And I also find them to be too bright, which can be equalized out. But without A-B comparison on a budget, I still don't think these are half bad. And the reason I believe that is because there are redeeming traits, and those redeeming traits being the transparency, being able to hear everything in the music. And some people may really like that. And these coupled with the subwoofer can be pretty immersive. Of course, A-B comparison, you can find their flaws very easily, but without A-B comparison, the flaws aren't as obvious. And as long as you can equalize out the treble, and you can pair these with the subwoofer, they can be enjoyable speakers to listen to, especially because of the transparency. I keep saying transparency, but you can hear everything in the music because these drivers are pretty much directly driven. So I wouldn't say they're complete trash, and I could absolutely see someone enjoying them and being impressed with them. If you have nothing to A-B compare these with, I would suggest maybe adding a subwoofer and possibly equalizing out the treble a little bit. But if you have them, just be happy to know that you're hearing everything that's in your music. Maybe not balanced, but there's something in your music, you're not missing it. And I think that's a pretty positive redeeming trait. And so this speaker may not be for everyone, but it gets a lot of negative reviews, but I don't think it's trash by any means. And I think also if someone was interested in making it a project, designing their own crossover, I think it'd be a fun little project as well. As far as for me, I'm not going to get rid of these speakers. I'm probably going to use them somewhere where I don't listen to music super critically, and I'll definitely have the treble equalized out. Well, hopefully this helped, and thanks for watching.